The electric clippers hummed like mechanical hornets as 12-year-old Nia Blackwood's carefully woven braids tumbled onto the cold linoleum floor of Riverside Middle School's nurse office. Miss Patricia Langford watched with barely concealed triumph, her fingers gripping the clippers as she methodically stripped away each protective strand, ignoring the child's desperate pleas and the nurse's uncomfortable shifting. She had finally found the perfect victim, a soft-spoken artist whose alopecia made her defenseless, whose military mother was deployed in classified operations overseas. But the smartphone footage secretly recorded by Nia's best friend, Sasha, would travel halfway around the world to reach Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood's secure communication device. What the school administration didn't realize as they prepared their damage control statements and one-day suspension paperwork was that they hadn't just humiliated a vulnerable child. They had declared war on a decorated officer who had spent 20 years dismantling enemies far more dangerous than a corrupt school system. And when Colonel Blackwood walked through those school doors 72 hours later, in full dress uniform, every person in that hallway instantly understood that this was no longer about hair. This was about justice. If you believe that no child should ever face what Nia endured, and that courage like hers deserves to be celebrated, type "respect" below. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of room 237 at Riverside Middle School in Columbus, Ohio, casting golden rectangles across Nia Blackwood's desk. The 12-year-old sat hunched over her sketchbook, her pencil dancing across the paper as she drew a phoenix rising from flames. Her intricate braided extensions cascaded over her shoulders, carefully concealing the patches where alopecia had claimed her natural hair since she was 9 years old. Nia Blackwood. Miss Patricia Langford's voice cut through the classroom like a blade. What exactly do you think you're doing? Nia's hand froze mid-stroke. Just finishing my algebra notes, Miss Langford, she whispered, not daring to look up. The 47-year-old teacher strode down the aisle, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum with military precision, a habit from her brief, unsuccessful stint in the army 8 years prior. Patricia towered over Nia's desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her grey-streaked blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. "That doesn't look like mathematics to me," Patricia said, snatching the sketchbook from Nia's desk. The class of 24 seventh graders fell silent as she flipped through pages of intricate drawings, soaring eagles, blooming flowers, and portraits of classmates rendered with surprising skill for someone so young. "This is exactly why your focus is scattered," Patricia continued, her voice rising, too busy playing artist to pay attention to real subjects. This was a lie. Nia maintained a 3.8 GPA and consistently ranked in the top 5% of her class. But Patricia had been waiting for this moment, planning it for weeks since she discovered whose daughter sat in her classroom. "And these braids," Patricia continued, her eyes narrowing as she examined Nia's carefully styled hair. "So elaborate, so attention-seeking. Don't you think it's excessive for a learning environment?" Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sasha Thornfield, Nia's best friend since kindergarten, watched from across the room with growing alarm. She'd witnessed Patricia's increasing hostility toward Nia over the past month. The snide comments about urban art styles, the deliberate mispronunciation of Nia's name, the way Patricia's eyes followed Nia with something that looked dangerously close to hatred. The morning announcements crackled over the PA system, temporarily interrupting the tense scene. Principal Kevin Pemberton's monotone voice filled the room. "Attention students and faculty. This is a reminder that our updated dress code policy goes into effect immediately. All students must comply with appearance standards as outlined in the revised handbook. Thank you for your cooperation." A cold smile spread across Patricia's thin lips. "Well, isn't that perfectly timed?" she said, tossing Nia's sketchbook back onto the desk with deliberate carelessness. "Stand up, Miss Blackwood." Nia slowly rose from her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. 24 pairs of eyes turned to watch, some curious, others sympathetic, all recognizing that something terrible was about to unfold. "Front of the class, please," Patricia instructed, pointing toward the whiteboard with theatrical authority. As Nia walked to the front on unsteady legs, Patricia circled her like a predator sizing up prey. Class, this is a perfect example of a dress code violation, she announced. These extensions are excessive and distracting. The handbook clearly states that hair must be neat and conservative. Ms. Langford, Nia whispered, her voice barely audible, I have a medical condition. My mom filed paperwork with the school. Speak up, Patricia interrupted sharply. If you have something to say, the whole class should hear it. Nia swallowed hard, her throat feeling like sandpaper. I have alopecia, she said, slightly louder. My mother got permission from Principal Pemberton for my hair. Patricia's expression hardened. This was the moment she'd been orchestrating since discovering that Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood, the woman who had ended her military career in disgrace, had a daughter in her classroom. A medical condition that requires fancy braids, Patricia scoffed. That's creative. I suppose you'll say anything to avoid following simple rules. She turned to address the class, her voice dripping with false authority. See how some students think they deserve special treatment? Rules apply to everyone equally. The classroom remained dead silent. Even at 12 years old, most of the students recognized injustice when they saw it. You have two choices, Patricia declared, moving closer to Nia. Remove those extensions right now, or you'll be sent home for violating school policy. Tears began forming in Nia's eyes. Please, I can't. My scalp, your mother isn't here to make excuses for you, Patricia cut her off, grabbing Nia's arm firmly. Let's go. We'll handle this in the nurse's office where you can fix your appearance properly. As Patricia pulled Nia toward the door, Sasha quickly slipped her phone from her pocket and pressed record, capturing the teacher's iron grip on her friend's arm and the fear written across Nia's face. What they didn't know was that this teacher had been waiting 8 years for revenge. The hallway of Riverside Middle School stretched endlessly as Patricia marched Nia toward the nurse's office, her fingers digging into the girl's upper arm with unnecessary force. Students from other classrooms glanced up as they passed, their curious eyes following the unfolding drama. Several teachers peered out their doorways, noting the disturbance but choosing not to intervene, a decision they would later regret. Nurse Williams, Patricia called as they entered the small medical office. This student is in clear violation of our dress code. She claims to have some sort of medical condition, but I have my doubts about the legitimacy of her excuse. Sarah Williams, the school nurse, looked up from her computer screen, her brow furrowing as she took in Nia's tear-streaked face and Patricia's grip on the child's arm. At 52, Sarah had worked in schools for over 15 years and had never seen a teacher handle a student so roughly over a dress code issue. What seems to be the problem? Sarah asked carefully, her instincts telling her something was very wrong with this situation. Her hair, Patricia stated flatly, finally releasing Nia's arm. It's against our new regulations. These elaborate extensions need to be removed immediately. I have alopecia, Nia managed to say through her tears. My mum filed all the medical paperwork. Please just check my file. Sarah moved toward her filing cabinet, her nursing training kicking in. Medical conditions affecting students' appearance were serious matters that required proper documentation and careful handling. Let me verify the medical exemption forms. Don't bother, Patricia interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I already checked her file this morning. There's nothing specific about hair accommodations, just a general medical form that doesn't cover appearance modifications. This was a complete fabrication, but Patricia delivered it with such confidence that Sarah hesitated. The nurse had worked with Patricia for 3 years and had never known her to outright lie about official documentation. But my mum spoke directly with Principal Pemberton, Nia insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. She explained everything about my condition. Please just call her. Patricia's expression shifted to one of false sympathy, a performance she had perfected over years of manipulation. Your mother is deployed overseas, isn't she? I understand this is difficult, but we can't make exceptions just because military families face unique challenges. Rules exist for good reasons: cleanliness, equality, and maintaining an appropriate learning environment. Sarah felt increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, but found herself caught between a colleague's apparent authority and a student's obvious distress. Perhaps we should contact her father first. I have documented parental consent on file, Patricia lied smoothly, her years of failed military training finally proving useful in civilian manipulation. "This is a standard school policy enforcement matter. We're authorized to ensure all students comply with dress code requirements." The nurse glanced between Patricia and Nia, uncertainty written across her face. She had never been asked to physically alter a student's appearance before, and every instinct told her this was wrong. But Patricia's confidence and apparent official backing made her question her own judgment. "I suppose if there's proper authorization," Sarah said reluctantly, though doubt continued to gnaw at her. "There is," Patricia assured her, already guiding Nia toward the examination chair. "Now, do you have clippers? These extensions need to come out completely." Nia's blood turned to ice water. "No, please," she begged, backing away from the chair. "You don't understand what this will do to me. My hair—" But Patricia was already positioning her in the seat, her grip firm and unyielding. "This is for your own good, Nia. Everyone follows the same rules here. No special treatment, no exceptions." Sarah reluctantly retrieved a set of electric clippers from a medical cabinet, her hands shaking slightly as she plugged them in. The mechanical buzz filled the small office like an angry swarm of insects. "That's enough," Sarah said weakly, but her protests were drowned out by the sound of the clippers and Nia's muffled sobs. With swift, merciless efficiency, Patricia began removing Nia's braided extensions, revealing the patchy, sparse hair beneath. Each section that fell to the floor took with it another piece of Nia's carefully constructed protection against the world's cruelty. But Patricia wasn't finished. The extensions had been just the beginning. "See?" Patricia said, her voice falsely cheerful as she continued operating the clippers. "That wasn't so difficult, but we need to ensure complete compliance with the grooming standards." The clippers continued their destructive path across Nia's scalp, removing what little natural hair remained. Tears streamed down the girl's face as she watched pieces of her identity fall to the cold linoleum floor. The reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall showed a stranger, a nearly bald child who looked like a cancer patient rather than a vibrant young artist. "Stop!" Sarah finally found her voice, reaching for Patricia's arm. "That's enough. You're going too far." But the damage was done. Nia sat in the chair, nearly bald, her hands trembling as they reached up to feel her exposed scalp. The cool air of the nurse's office stung against her skin, and she could feel every bump and imperfection that her beautiful braids had hidden. "There," Patricia said with satisfaction, switching off the clippers and placing them back on the counter. "Now you're in full compliance with school policy. Wasn't that simple?" Nia couldn't speak. Her entire world had been shattered in the span of 10 minutes. Her body shook with silent sobs as the reality of her new appearance sank in. "I'll give you a few minutes to collect yourself," Patricia continued, as if she had just administered routine first aid rather than psychological torture. "Then you can return to class and continue your education without any distractions." She exited the office, leaving Nia alone with Sarah, who stood frozen in horror at what she had just witnessed. "I'm so sorry," the nurse whispered, clearly distressed by her own participation in the assault. "I didn't realize. I should have." But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. The damage was irreversible, and apologies couldn't restore what had been taken. "I want my mum," Nia finally whispered, her voice so small it was barely audible. "I'll call your father right away," Sarah promised, reaching for the phone with shaking hands. "Just wait here, honey, everything will be okay." But they both knew that wasn't true. Some things once broken could never be entirely repaired. Meanwhile, outside the nurse's office, Sasha had been waiting anxiously. When the door cracked open, she peered inside and nearly gasped aloud at the sight of her best friend. Without hesitation, she slipped inside, immediately pulling off her hoodie and gently placing it over Nia's nearly bald head. "I saw what happened," Sasha whispered, her young voice trembling with rage. "I recorded some of it. My sister is going to help us upload it online. That monster can't get away with this." Nia said nothing. She pulled the hoodie tight around her face and stared blankly ahead, retreating into a silence that would last for days. But Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood had no idea her past was about to collide with her daughter's present. That evening, as news of the incident began circulating through the tight-knit community of military families, at nearby Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Riverside Middle School issued a carefully crafted statement designed to minimize damage and deflect responsibility. The brief press release, distributed through the school's website and local media contacts, read, "We are aware of a disciplinary misunderstanding that occurred today involving a student and a staff member. The teacher involved has been placed on administrative leave for 1 day while we conduct a thorough investigation. The privacy of all parties will be respected during this process, and we are committed to resolving this matter swiftly and appropriately." Notably absent from the statement was any mention of the physical alteration of a student's appearance, the medical condition that made the assault particularly cruel, or the fact that a 12-year-old girl had been traumatized by an adult in a position of trust. Vincent Blackwood paced the living room of their modest home in Fairborn, Ohio, his cell phone pressed tightly against his ear as he left increasingly urgent messages for his wife. The former Army sergeant had been trying to reach Quincy for hours, but communication with her classified operation overseas was limited at best. "Quincy, call me the moment you get this," he said, his voice strained with barely controlled emotion. "It's about Naya. Something happened at school today. It's bad, really bad." He ended the call and ran a weathered hand over his face, exhaustion etched in every line. At 41, Vincent had seen his share of difficult situations during his military service, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless rage he felt watching his daughter's spirit crumble. Upstairs, Nia hadn't spoken a word since he'd picked her up from school. She had simply handed him Sasha's hoodie and walked silently to the car, her exposed scalp a shocking sight that had unleashed a flood of emotions Vincent struggled to contain. Anger, confusion, heartbreak, and a burning desire to march back into that school and demand answers warred within him. But Nia needed him to be strong, so he had driven home calmly, helped her inside when her legs seemed too weak to carry her, and was now trying to figure out how to protect his daughter when the person who had hurt her was supposed to be protecting her too. Vincent knocked gently on Nia's bedroom door. "Dinner's ready, sweetheart," he called softly. No response. "Nia?" He pushed the door open slightly. She sat motionless on her bed, staring at the wall, the hoodie still pulled over her head like armor against the world. "You need to eat something," he continued, placing a plate of her favorite pasta on her desk. When she didn't respond, he added, "I love you, Nia. We're going to fix this, okay? But how do you fix something like this? How do you restore a child's sense of safety and dignity once it's been shattered by the very institution meant to nurture her?" While Vincent struggled with these impossible questions, across town, Principal Kevin Pemberton was dealing with his own crisis. The 58-year-old administrator had spent the afternoon in damage control mode, fielding calls from concerned parents, district officials, and even a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch who had somehow gotten wind of the story. At 7 p.m. he called an emergency meeting in his office. The blinds were drawn, and his secretary had strict instructions not to interrupt under any circumstances. "This is a complete disaster," Pemberton muttered, loosening his tie as he looked across his desk at Patricia, who sat stiffly in one of the visitor chairs, her posture defensive despite the circumstances. The third person in the room, Harold Brennan, was the school district's attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his early 60s whose sole job was protecting the district from exactly this type of liability. "What the hell were you thinking, Patricia?" Pemberton demanded. "Shaving a student's head? A student with a documented medical condition?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "I was enforcing the dress code as instructed." The girl was being defiant, and her appearance was disruptive to the learning environment. Sometimes strict measures are necessary to maintain order. Brennan cleared his throat, tapping his pen against his legal pad. "Let's focus on damage control rather than assigning blame. The preliminary reports suggest this was captured on video by another student. We need to get ahead of this narrative before it spirals out of control." "Captured on video?" Pemberton's face went pale. "You mean there's actual footage of what happened?" "Partial footage," Brennan clarified. "Nothing showing the actual hair removal, from what we understand. Just the student being escorted to the nurse's office. We can frame this as a misunderstanding about medical documentation." Patricia nodded eagerly. "Exactly. The girl claimed to have some medical condition, but there was nothing specific in her file about hair exemptions." I followed proper procedures based on the information available to me. This was another lie, but Patricia had convinced herself that her version of events was not only justified, but heroic. In her mind, she was a dedicated educator, being attacked for maintaining standards in an increasingly permissive educational system. Was there actually documentation about this student's medical condition? Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. There might have been some general medical paperwork, Pemberton admitted reluctantly, but nothing specific about hair accommodations that I recall. Another lie. The truth was that Quincy Blackwood had met personally with Pemberton 6 months earlier to discuss Nia's alopecia and the psychological importance of her protective hairstyles. They had filled out extensive medical exemption forms, and Pemberton had personally assured Quincy that her daughter would be protected from exactly this type of harassment. Here's our strategy, Brennan continued. We acknowledge that a disciplinary incident occurred. We express regret that proper communication procedures weren't followed, hence the one-day administrative leave. But we don't admit to any specific wrongdoing. We cite student privacy laws to avoid discussing details. And if the parents push for more? Pemberton asked. We offer private mediation, Brennan replied smoothly. Keep it out of the courts and the media. Maybe offer some counseling services for the student, possibly a transfer to another classroom, to avoid future personality conflicts. As the three adults plotted their cover-up strategy, they had no idea that their conversation was about to become irrelevant. Because 3,000 miles away, Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood was finally accessing her encrypted communications, and the carefully recorded video message from her husband was about to change everything. Meanwhile, Nia sat in her darkening bedroom, her sketchpad open beside her but untouched. The characters she had always drawn, brave, colorful heroes who overcame obstacles through determination and kindness, now seemed childish and meaningless. She ran her hand over her scalp again, feeling the uneven patches where Patricia had been particularly rough with the clippers. The physical sensation was strange, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness inside her chest. In her mind, she kept replaying the moment when the first braid fell to the floor. The sudden exposure, the satisfaction in Patricia's eyes, the complete helplessness she had felt as pieces of her protection were stripped away. What Vincent found in that nurse's file would change everything. Vincent couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., he found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the anonymous note that had been slipped under their front door sometime during the evening. The handwritten message was brief but explosive. Check the nurse's files, they know what happened. The complaint was filed 2 weeks ago. A friend. Someone on the inside was reaching out. Someone who knew the truth and was willing to risk their job to expose it. Vincent's hand shook as he read the message again. A complaint filed 2 weeks ago? That meant Nia had tried to report Patricia's harassment before the assault happened. It meant the school had been warned, and they had done nothing. Unable to wait until morning, Vincent made a decision that would prove crucial to their case. He called the one person he knew would still be awake at this hour, Marcus Williams, the night janitor at Riverside Middle School and a fellow veteran who had served under Vincent during their deployment to Afghanistan. Marcus, Vincent said when his old friend answered the phone, I need your help. It's about what happened to Nia today. There was a long pause before Marcus replied, his voice heavy with emotion. I heard about it, Vince. My Sarah came home crying. She's the nurse who she feels terrible about what happened. Can you get me into the school tonight? I need to see Nia's file. Another pause. That's risky, brother. I could lose my job. A 12-year-old girl was assaulted today, Vincent said quietly. Your wife was forced to participate. We both know this isn't going to stop with Nia unless someone takes a stand. Marcus sighed deeply. Maintenance entrance on the east side, 20 minutes, and Vince, bring a camera, whatever you find, document everything. 25 minutes later, Vincent stood in the darkened hallways of Riverside Middle School, his phone's flashlight beam dancing ahead of him as Marcus led the way to the nurse's office. Medical files are in the cabinet marked Student Health Records, Marcus whispered, though they were alone in the building. Sarah told me Nia's folder should be near the front since her last name starts with B. Vincent moved quickly through the alphabetically organized files until he found it. A manila folder labeled Blackwood Nia, Grade 7. His heart raced as he opened it and began photographing each document with his phone. The first few pages were routine: vaccination records, emergency contact information, annual physical exam results. But then he found what the anonymous note had referenced, a formal complaint form titled Student Harassment Report, dated exactly 14 days before the assault. In Nia's careful handwriting, the form described weeks of escalating harassment by Ms. Langford. She makes comments about my hair being distracting and inappropriate for school, Nia had written. She calls it urban styling in a way that sounds mean. Yesterday she said my braids make me look like I'm trying too hard to be different, and that I should focus on fitting in rather than standing out. The form was signed and dated by Nia, with a section for administrative response. In red ink across the bottom, someone had scrawled, "Discussed with student, no action required. Student counseled about appropriate appearance and attitude adjustment." The signature on that dismissal belonged to Principal Pemberton himself. Vincent's hands trembled as he photographed the document. They had known. Nia had followed proper procedures, reported the harassment through official channels, and the administration had not only ignored her complaint, but had essentially blamed her for the treatment she was receiving. But that wasn't all. Digging deeper into the file, Vincent found the medical exemption forms that Quincy had filed 6 months earlier. Page after page of detailed documentation about Nia's alopecia, psychological assessments explaining the importance of protective styling for her mental health, and explicit requests for accommodations regarding hair and appearance policies. Every single form bore Pemberton's signature of approval. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a communication breakdown. This was a deliberate attack on a vulnerable child by adults who had been specifically warned about her condition and had sworn to protect her. "Find what you were looking for?" Marcus asked as Vincent carefully returned the file to its proper place. "More than I expected," Vincent replied grimly. "Marcus, thank your wife for me. What happened today wasn't her fault. She was manipulated by someone who knew exactly what she was doing." As they prepared to leave the building, Marcus handed Vincent a small flash drive. "Security footage from the hallway cameras," he explained. "Sarah asked me to get it before they accidentally delete it like they did with the nurse's office recording." Vincent stared at the drive. "They already deleted the footage from inside the nurse's office?" "Pemberton ordered it destroyed this afternoon," Marcus confirmed. "Said it was for student privacy, but the hallway cameras are on a different system. This shows Patricia dragging Nia down the corridor. You can see the fear on that baby's face." As Vincent drove home through the empty streets of Fairborn, his mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. This wasn't just about one teacher's cruelty or one administrator's negligence. This was about a system that protected adults at the expense of children, that silenced victims and covered up abuse. But they had chosen the wrong family to target. 3 time zones away on a secure military base, whose location couldn't be disclosed, Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood finally accessed the encrypted message from her husband. The video file took several minutes to download over the classified network, but when it finally played, her world shifted on its axis. The footage was grainy and brief. Just 30 seconds of Sasha's smartphone recording, showing Patricia gripping Nia's arm and marching her down the hallway. But Quincy could see everything she needed to see in her daughter's face. Terror, confusion, and a desperate plea for help that no 12-year-old should ever have to make. The accompanying message from Vincent was devastating in its brevity. "Nia was assaulted at school today. Teacher shaved her head completely. Claims it was dress code violation. Nia hasn't spoken since. She needs you. I need you. Please come home." Quincy's military training kicked in immediately. 20 years of service had taught her to compartmentalize emotion and focus on mission objectives. But this wasn't a military operation. This was her child. Within 15 minutes, she was in her commanding officer's quarters, requesting emergency family leave. Within 2 hours, she was on a military transport aircraft headed back to the United States, her mind already formulating a strategy that would make her previous combat operations look like training exercises. Someone had hurt her daughter. Someone had exploited their power to humiliate and traumatize a vulnerable child. That someone was about to learn why Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood's combat effectiveness reports consistently rated her as exceptionally dangerous when provoked. As the transport plane soared across continents, Quincy made a silent promise to her daughter. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And when she walked through the doors of Riverside Middle School, everyone involved would understand exactly what it meant to declare war on a woman who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of strategic destruction. The administration thought they could cover this up with bureaucratic maneuvering and legal disclaimers. They were about to discover the difference between civilian authority and military justice. When Colonel Blackwood walked through those school doors 72 hours later, in full dress uniform, every person in that hallway instantly understood that this was no longer about hair. This was about justice. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the visitor parking lot of Riverside Middle School as Lieutenant Colonel Quincy Blackwood pulled her black sedan into a space marked "Official Business Only." She hadn't been home long enough to change out of her dress military uniform, nor did she want to. Every ribbon, medal, and insignia on her chest represented years of service, dedication, and the kind of authority that Patricia Langford had forgotten existed. 26 hours of travel had left her physically exhausted, but adrenaline and righteous fury kept fatigue at bay. The woman who stepped out of that car bore little resemblance to the warm, patient mother Nia knew. This was Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, a combat veteran who had commanded battalions in hostile territory and had never lost a single engagement. "Remember what we discussed," Vincent said from the passenger seat, his voice tight with concern. "These people aren't worth destroying your career over." Quincy adjusted her service cap with precision, checking her reflection in the side mirror. Her usually warm brown eyes had hardened into something resolute and unyielding. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice measured and controlled. "This isn't about my career, this is about our daughter." The calm in her tone was more frightening than any display of anger could have been. She had spent the flight home reviewing every detail of the situation, analyzing it with the same strategic mindset that had made her one of the most effective officers in her unit. The evidence Vincent had gathered, the timeline of events, the school's response, it all painted a picture of institutional corruption and deliberate cruelty that demanded a proportional response. The hallway of Riverside Middle School fell silent as Quincy entered through the main doors. Her military boots struck the polished floor with rhythmic authority, each step echoing off the walls like a countdown to judgment. Students pressed themselves against lockers, conversations dying mid-sentence as they recognized the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Teachers emerged from their classrooms, curious about the sudden hush, only to step back when they saw her approaching. The dress blue uniform commanded immediate respect, but there was something in Quincy's expression, a controlled intensity that suggested barely contained power, that made even the most authoritative faculty members suddenly find urgent reasons to return to their work. A young substitute teacher started to approach her, probably to ask if she needed directions, then thought better of it and retreated to her classroom. The janitor who was mopping the far end of the hall nodded slightly as she passed, a gesture of subtle solidarity from one service member to another. Quincy didn't break stride. She moved with the confident bearing of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what she intended to accomplish when she got there. The teacher's lounge door stood halfway open when she reached it. Inside, several faculty members were gathered around the coffee machine for their afternoon break, including a thin woman with graying blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. Patricia Langford stood with her back to the door, a coffee cup halfway to her lips, as she complained to her colleagues about helicopter parents and military families who think they deserve special treatment. Quincy pushed the door fully open. The conversation inside died instantly. Patricia turned, coffee cup trembling slightly in her hand, as recognition flashed across her face, followed immediately by something Quincy had seen many times in combat zones, the unmistakable look of someone who suddenly realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood," Patricia stammered, attempting to regain her composure. I didn't realize you were back from your deployment." "Clearly," Quincy replied, her voice arctic. She remained in the doorway, her presence filling the small room like a gathering storm. The other teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One by one, they found excuses to leave, sudden lesson plans to review, copies to make, urgent emails to answer. They squeezed past Quincy with averted eyes, their discomfort palpable, until only Patricia remained in the room. "I was simply enforcing school policy," Patricia said, attempting to project authority she no longer felt. "Perhaps if you had been more present in your daughter's educational life, these misunderstandings could have been avoided." The accusation hung in the air like a lit fuse. "Don't," Quincy said quietly, taking a single step into the room. "Don't you dare try to make this about my deployment or my dedication to my daughter. We both know exactly what this is really about." The air between them crackled with tension, heavy with an unspoken history that went back years. "I don't know what you're implying," Patricia began, but her voice lacked conviction. "Fort Benning," Quincy said, just two words that hit Patricia like a physical blow. 2016. Does that refresh your memory, Private Langford? Or did you think I wouldn't recognize you? Patricia's face drained of color. Her coffee cup clattered against the saucer as her hands began to shake. "You were in my training unit," Quincy continued, her voice deadly quiet. "Discharged after multiple infractions and failing basic qualifications 3 times. You filed false reports about your fellow trainees, specifically your black colleagues, claiming they received preferential treatment when your own performance was substandard." "That was different," Patricia whispered, all her bluster evaporating. "You had it in for me from day one, you all did." "Because you couldn't follow orders," Quincy replied. "Because you showed up unprepared, blamed everyone else for your failures, and filed harassment complaints every time you were held accountable for your own incompetence. Sound familiar?" Patricia set her cup down with shaking hands, unable to meet Quincy's steady gaze. "You can't prove anything, not then, not now." Quincy stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have. "I don't need to prove it. I lived it. And now my daughter has lived it too." She leaned in slightly, her military bearing making her appear to tower over Patricia, despite being only slightly taller. "This isn't over, Patricia, not by a long shot. You picked the wrong family to target, and you chose the wrong child to hurt." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "One more thing," Quincy added as she turned to leave. "If you ever come near my daughter again, if you so much as look in her direction, you'll discover exactly why my unit called me the Hammer. And unlike the army, I won't give you 3 chances to get it right." As Quincy strode toward Principal Pemberton's office, memories from her military past surfaced with crystal clarity. Patricia Langford, then Private Langford, had been a problem from her very first day of basic training, constantly undermining her black peers, claiming they received preferential treatment, filing complaints whenever she was corrected or disciplined. The pattern had been consistent and disturbing: failure to meet standards, blame everyone else, claim discrimination when held accountable. After being discharged, Patricia had made threats about making them all pay someday, and finding ways to show them what real authority looked like. Now, 8 years later, she had found her target, the daughter of the woman who had ended her military aspirations. The realization made Quincy's blood run cold, but she maintained her composure as she approached the administrative office. This wasn't just about educational policy or miscommunication. This was personal revenge enacted against a child. Pemberton's secretary attempted to stop her. "Excuse me, do you have an appointment?" Quincy didn't break stride. "He'll see me," she said with quiet authority, opening the principal's door without knocking. Kevin Pemberton looked up from his computer, irritation flashing across his face before recognition set in. At 58, he had been hoping to coast through his final years before retirement without major incidents. The events of the past 2 days had shattered those hopes completely. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said quickly, standing and attempting to project calm authority. "We weren't expecting you. I understand you're concerned about—" "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood," she corrected him, her voice sharp as a blade. "And you should have been expecting me the moment your employee assaulted my daughter." Pemberton gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Please, sit down. I understand you're upset, and we want to work together to resolve this situation appropriately." "I'm not upset, Mr. Pemberton," Quincy replied, remaining standing. "Upset is what parents feel when their child fails a test or gets detention. I'm methodical. There's a significant difference." She placed a military-style folder on his desk, the label reading Incident Report, Blackwood, N. Assault and educational negligence, civil rights violation. "What's this?" Pemberton asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know the answer. "This," Quincy said coldly, "is what handling a situation actually looks like. My team has compiled witness statements, medical documentation of Nia's condition, copies of all the exemption forms we filed with your office, and evidence of the harassment complaint that you personally dismissed 2 weeks ago." Pemberton's confident demeanor began to falter. "Now let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ms. Langford has been disciplined with administrative leave, and we're conducting a thorough review." "A one-day suspension is not discipline," Quincy interrupted. "It's a paid vacation. And your thorough review conveniently ignores the fact that you had advance warning of Ms. Langford's targeting behavior and chose to blame the victim instead of protecting her." She tapped the folder with her index finger. "Inside, you'll also find evidence that Ms. Langford has a documented history of racially motivated incidents, both during her failed military service and here at your school. This isn't her first time targeting a black child, though it may be her most brazen." Pemberton's face darkened. "These are serious allegations you're making, Mrs. Colonel Blackwood. You're essentially accusing this entire institution of systematic discrimination." "I'm not making allegations," Quincy corrected. "I'm presenting documented facts. And yes, I am accusing your institution of systematic discrimination, because that's exactly what happened to my daughter." She leaned forward slightly, her military bearing making the gesture seem commanding rather than aggressive. "Your employee used her position of authority to enact personal revenge against a 12-year-old child with a medical condition. Your administration had multiple opportunities to prevent this assault and chose instead to ignore warning signs and dismiss legitimate complaints. Your district's response has been to minimize, deflect, and cover up rather than take responsibility. You're threatening the reputation of this entire school over one unfortunate incident," Pemberton said, his voice rising with desperation. "I'm not threatening anything," Quincy replied evenly. "I'm informing you of consequences. The documentation in that folder will be submitted to the State Education Board, the Office for Civil Rights, the ACLU, and if necessary, national media outlets. Your reputation was destroyed the moment you allowed an adult to assault a child under your protection." She straightened, her full military bearing on display. "You have a choice, Mr. Pemberton. You can continue this path of denial and cover-up, in which case you'll discover what it means to fight a public battle against someone with my training and resources. Or you can take immediate, meaningful action to address what happened and ensure it never happens again." "What kind of action are you talking about?" Pemberton asked, though his tone suggested he was already calculating damage control strategies. "Ms. Langford's immediate termination and criminal prosecution, a formal apology to my daughter, and a public acknowledgement of the school's failures. Implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination policies with real oversight. And financial compensation for the trauma inflicted on my child." Pemberton's face went pale. "Those demands are completely unreasonable. The teachers' union alone would—" "Mr. Pemberton," Quincy cut him off, "my daughter was physically assaulted by your employee after you ignored her written complaint about harassment. A 12-year-old girl with a medical condition was traumatized by an adult who was supposed to protect her. There is nothing unreasonable about demanding justice for that." She picked up her folder and headed toward the door. "I'll give you 24 hours to consider your options. After that, this becomes a very public conversation about how Riverside Middle School treats its most vulnerable students." As she reached the door, Quincy paused and looked back. "Oh, and Mr. Pemberton, you might want to review your security footage policies. Destroying evidence in a case involving child assault tends to attract unwanted attention from federal investigators. But what Quincy discovered about the school board would make her military training look like child's play." That same afternoon, while Quincy was confronting the school administration, Patricia Langford sat in a small office at Channel 6 News, adjusting her collar nervously as a producer clipped a wireless microphone to her blouse. She had spent the morning with her hastily hired attorney, Lawrence Whitfield, preparing for this interview. Her chance to tell her side of the story before the narrative got completely away from her. "We'll be live in 3 minutes," the producer announced. "Just remember what we discussed. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and emphasize your dedication to student welfare." Patricia nodded, practicing her most sympathetic expression in the monitor. In her mind, she had transformed from aggressor to victim, a dedicated educator being persecuted by an entitled military family who expected special treatment for their child. When the red light came on, she was ready. "Thank you for having me," she said to anchor Jessica Martinez, her voice carefully modulated to convey wounded professionalism. "I think it's important that people hear the truth about what really happened, rather than the sensationalized version that's being spread on social media." "And what is the truth, Ms. Langford?" Jessica asked, her expression neutral but alert. "I was simply doing my job," Patricia replied, her voice quavering slightly for effect. Riverside Middle School had implemented a strict dress code policy, and as educators, we're expected to enforce these rules fairly and consistently. This particular student had been repeatedly warned about her inappropriate hairstyle, which was disruptive to the learning environment. "The student's family claims she has a medical condition called alopecia," Jessica noted. "Were you aware of this when the incident occurred?" "There was nothing in her file about any hair-related medical exemptions," Patricia countered quickly, a statement that was technically true since she had never actually checked Naya's file. "The girl claimed to have some condition, but students will say anything to avoid following simple rules. We see this constantly in education today." Jessica's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you suggesting that a 12-year-old fabricated a medical condition to avoid dress code compliance?" "I'm saying that without proper documentation, teachers have to rely on established policies," Patricia deflected. "And frankly, I think this situation is being blown completely out of proportion, because the child's mother is in the military. She's using her position to intimidate the school district and gain sympathy for what was simply a routine disciplinary matter." The anchor's expression shifted, becoming noticeably cooler. "Ms. Langford, multiple witnesses have reported that you physically removed the student's hair extensions and then continued to shave her head nearly bald. How do you justify that level of intervention?" Patricia's practiced composure cracked slightly. "Look, I've dedicated 20 years of my life to education. I've worked with thousands of students from all backgrounds, and my only concern has always been their welfare and success. Now my reputation and career are being destroyed because one parent doesn't believe the rules should apply to her child." "But what about the allegation that you have a personal history with Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood from your time in the military?" Patricia's face flushed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "This is exactly what I mean. They're creating conspiracy theories to deflect from the real issue, which is a student who consistently violated school policy and a parent who thinks military service entitles her family to special treatment." The interview continued for another 8 minutes, with Patricia growing increasingly defensive and contradictory. By the time it ended, she had inadvertently confirmed several details that would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, across town, Vincent Blackwood was having a very different kind of media experience. After the anonymous tip about Naya's file, he had reached out to investigative journalist Derek Morrison at the Columbus Dispatch, a reporter known for his coverage of institutional corruption and civil rights violations. Morrison had been following the story since the first social media posts appeared, and Vincent's documentation provided exactly the kind of evidence needed to transform a local incident into a story with national implications. "This isn't just about one teacher or one school," Morrison explained as he reviewed the photographed documents. "This is about a system that prioritizes protecting adults over protecting children. Your wife's military background adds another layer. The idea that someone would target a service member's child while that parent is deployed overseas is going to resonate far beyond Ohio." Vincent nodded grimly. "Quincy always said the hardest part of deployment wasn't the danger. It was trusting other people to protect our family while she was gone. This betrays that trust in the worst possible way." Morrison's article, published online that evening with the headline, "Military Child Assaulted at School While Mother Deployed Overseas," included high-resolution images of Naya's harassment complaint, the medical exemption forms, and the timeline showing the school's knowledge and inaction. The story was picked up by military news outlets, shared across social media by service member families, and forwarded through the tight-knit community of military spouses who recognized that this could have happened to any of their children. By midnight, Justice for Nia was trending nationally, and Riverside Middle School's phone system had crashed under the volume of angry calls from around the country. But the real revelation was still coming. At 2 a.m., Quincy received an encrypted email from someone identifying himself as Alex Baker, Riverside Middle School's IT technician. The message was brief but explosive. "Colonel Blackwood, I've been following what happened to your daughter. There's something you need to know about the security footage from the nurse's office. Principal Pemberton ordered me to delete it from our servers the morning after the incident. I told him it was gone, but I was able to recover it from our backup system. If you're interested in seeing what actually happened, we can meet somewhere away from school grounds. This isn't right, and I can't stay silent anymore." Quincy immediately forwarded the email to Vincent and called the number Alex had provided. When he answered, she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "I could lose my job for this," Alex said. "But I keep thinking about my own daughter. She's only 8, but she could be in Nia's place someday. Someone has to stand up and say this is wrong." They arranged to meet at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Columbus, far from anyone connected to the school district. Alex turned out to be a slight man in his early 30s, wearing a Columbus Blue Jackets hoodie and looking like he hadn't slept in days. "I've worked in school IT for 7 years, he explained as he handed Quincy a secure flash drive. "I've seen a lot of things get covered up, fights, accidents, even some inappropriate teacher behavior. But this was different. The way Pemberton acted, the pressure to make this disappear completely, it made me sick. The footage was worse than anything Quincy had imagined. The nurse's office cameras had captured everything in devastating detail. Patricia forcibly holding Nia in the chair, the child's desperate attempts to explain her condition, the systematic destruction of her protective hairstyle, and Patricia's obvious satisfaction as she reduced a 12-year-old to tears. But the most damning part was the audio. The school's official story claimed that Patricia believed she had proper authorization and was unaware of Nia's medical condition. The recording told a different story entirely. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Patricia could be heard saying as she switched on the clippers. "This little princess needs to learn that her mother's rank doesn't make her special here. Time for a reality check about how the real world works." Nurse Williams could be heard protesting weakly. "Maybe we should call her parents first or check with—" "I have all the authorization I need," Patricia interrupted. "Trust me, this is long overdue. Her mother destroyed my military career, and now it's time for some payback." The recording continued for 12 excruciating minutes, capturing not just the physical assault, but the psychological torture of a child who was being punished for her mother's professional decisions 8 years earlier. "There's more," Alex said quietly. "I pulled the email logs from Pemberton's account. He's been in communication with the district's legal team since before this happened. They've been planning damage control strategies for weeks, like they knew something was coming." Quincy studied the additional documents Alex had provided. A paper trail showing that the school administration had been aware of Patricia's targeting behavior toward minority students for months, but had chosen to protect her rather than investigate the complaints. "Alex," Quincy said finally, "I need you to understand what you're risking by coming forward with this. They're going to try to destroy your credibility, attack your character, maybe even file criminal charges for unauthorized access to school systems." Alex nodded. "I know. But I can't live with staying silent while they cover this up. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but she didn't see what I saw on that video. No child should ever go through what your daughter experienced." As they prepared to leave the diner, Alex's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or we'll bury you too." Quincy's military training immediately kicked in. "Give me your phone," she said, photographing the threatening message. "From now on, you don't go anywhere alone and you document everything. Someone is getting desperate, which means we're getting close to something they really don't want exposed. What they found in that hidden video didn't just show assault. It showed premeditated cruelty. Within 48 hours of receiving Alex's evidence, Quincy had assembled a legal team that would have impressed even the most seasoned civil rights attorneys. At the center was Grace Yamada, a third-generation Japanese-American lawyer, whose grandparents had survived the World War II internment camps and who had dedicated her career to fighting institutional discrimination. Grace's downtown office had become a war room, with multiple monitors displaying evidence, timeline charts covering the walls, and a team of investigators working around the clock to build what would become one of the most comprehensive school assault cases in Ohio history. "I've reviewed everything," Grace said as she met with the Blackwood family on a Wednesday morning. "The video evidence, the medical documentation, the harassment complaint that was ignored, the text messages between school board members discussing damage control strategies. This isn't just a civil case anymore, this is criminal." She turned to Quincy and Vincent, her expression serious. "I want to be completely transparent about what we're facing. The school district has deep pockets and powerful connections. They're going to fight this with everything they have, and they're going to try to destroy your family's reputation in the process." "Let them try," Quincy replied quietly. "They chose to make this a war when they hurt my daughter. I've been preparing for this fight my entire adult life." That afternoon, the Franklin County District Attorney's Office announced that criminal charges were being filed against Patricia Langford for assault, child endangerment, and civil rights violations. The announcement sent shockwaves through the educational community across Ohio and beyond. The charges detailed not just the physical assault, but the premeditated nature of the attack, Patricia's abuse of her position of authority, and the deliberate targeting of a child because of her race and her mother's military service. Principal Pemberton, faced with the mounting evidence and the prospect of being named as a co-conspirator, made a desperate decision. He requested an emergency meeting with Quincy and Grace, hoping to negotiate some form of settlement that would save his career and pension. The meeting took place in Grace's conference room, with Pemberton accompanied by 2 district attorneys and a crisis management consultant who had been flown in from Chicago specifically to handle high-profile educational scandals. "We're prepared to make a substantial offer," Pemberton began, his usual confidence replaced by barely concealed desperation. "Full medical and psychological coverage for Nia, a college scholarship fund, and a significant financial settlement. In exchange, we would need a non-disclosure agreement and a statement that this was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect the district's values." Grace didn't even glance at the settlement offer before sliding it back across the table. "Mr. Pemberton, you still don't understand what this is about. This was never about money." "Then what do you want?" the crisis consultant interjected. "Name your price. Every problem has a solution if the compensation is appropriate." Quincy leaned forward, her military bearing making the gesture seem commanding rather than aggressive. "What I want is justice for my daughter, and systematic change to ensure no other child experiences what she went through. What I want is accountability for every adult who failed in their duty to protect her. What I want is a public acknowledgement that what happened was wrong and a commitment to real reform." She stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "You can't buy silence from someone whose child was assaulted, Mr. Pemberton. You can't negotiate away the trauma you inflicted on a 12-year-old girl. And you certainly can't pay me to pretend that your institution isn't fundamentally broken." As they prepared to leave, the crisis consultant made one final attempt. "Colonel Blackwood, you should consider the impact this publicity will have on your daughter. Children are resilient, but being the center of a national controversy could damage her more than the original incident." Quincy turned back, her eyes flashing with controlled anger. "My daughter has already been damaged by adults who were supposed to protect her. The only way to help her heal is to ensure that her suffering leads to justice and change. She needs to see that standing up to bullies, even institutional bullies, is worth the fight." The criminal trial began 3 weeks later, and from the opening statements it was clear that this case would reshape how schools across the country handled discrimination and abuse. But when the jury saw that footage, their faces revealed the verdict before it was spoken. The Franklin County Courthouse had never seen media attention like this. National news vans lined the street, protesters holding signs reading "Justice for Nia," and Protect Our Children filled the sidewalks, and security had to be increased to manage the crowds of people who had traveled from across the country to witness what many were calling a landmark case in educational civil rights. Inside Courtroom B, Judge Eleanor Barnes called the court to order. At 63, she had presided over thousands of cases during her career, but few had captured public attention like this one. The gallery was packed to capacity, with overflow seating set up in an adjacent courtroom where people could watch via closed-circuit television. Nia sat between her parents in the front row, wearing a colorful head wrap that had become her signature style in the weeks since the assault. She had chosen to attend the trial despite her parents' concerns, saying that she needed to see justice happen with her own eyes. Grace Yamada rose for her opening statement, moving to stand directly in front of the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the most fundamental duty we have as a society, protecting our children from those who would abuse their power to cause harm. She paused, making eye contact with each juror before continuing. The evidence you will see and hear over the next several days will prove that Ms. Patricia Langford deliberately and maliciously assaulted 12-year-old Nia Blackwood, not because of any violation of school policy, but as an act of personal revenge against the child's mother. The prosecutor's opening was methodical and devastating, outlining the timeline of events, the ignored warning signs, and the cover-up that followed. When she finished, the defense attorney, Lawrence Whitfield, hired by the district's insurance company, rose to present Patricia's version of events. This case is about a dedicated educator who made a difficult decision in a challenging situation, Whitfield began. Ms. Langford believed she was enforcing legitimate school policy when she addressed a student's non-compliance with dress code requirements. What happened was unfortunate, but it was not criminal. His argument focused on the chaos of managing hundreds of students, the pressure teachers faced to maintain order, and the claim that Patricia had genuinely believed she was acting within her authority. But when the video evidence was presented on the third day of trial, the defense's narrative crumbled completely. The courtroom fell silent as the nurse's office footage played on large monitors. Even spectators who had read detailed accounts of the assault were unprepared for the reality of watching a grown woman systematically strip away a child's dignity while ignoring her desperate pleas. The audio was even more damaging. Patricia's voice, clear and unmistakable. This little princess needs to learn that her mother's rank doesn't make her special here. Time for a reality check about how the real world works. Several jurors wiped away tears as they watched Nia's reaction to seeing her reflection after the assault. The complete bewilderment of a child who couldn't understand what she had done to deserve such treatment. When Nia was called to testify, Judge Barnes had made special accommodations. A privacy screen was erected so she wouldn't have to look directly at Patricia, and a support counselor sat nearby. "Nia," Grace asked gently, "can you tell us what Ms. Langford said to you while she was removing your hair?" Nia's voice was quiet but steady. "She said my mom thought she was better than everyone else because she was in the army. She said I needed to learn that being black didn't make me special. She said my hair was ugly and that I looked like I was trying too hard to be something I wasn't." "How did that make you feel?" "Like I was being punished for something I didn't understand," Nia replied. "Like there was something wrong with me for having the disease that makes my hair fall out, like I wasn't supposed to exist." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Patricia's attorney looked down at his notes, unable to watch the child he was supposedly defending against false accusations. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the psychologist who had been treating Nia since the assault. "The trauma from this incident goes far beyond the physical act," Dr. Mitchell explained. Nia was attacked at her point of greatest vulnerability, her medical condition that she had worked so hard to manage privately. The perpetrator specifically targeted the very thing that made her feel most insecure. She continued, "The fact that this attack came from a teacher, someone Nia had been taught to trust and respect, has created deep trauma around authority figures and institutional settings. She experiences panic attacks when entering school buildings, has difficulty concentrating in classroom environments, and suffers from severe anxiety about her appearance." When the defense cross-examined Dr. Mitchell, They tried to suggest that Naya's trauma was being exaggerated for financial gain. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Dr. Mitchell calmly presented detailed medical records showing panic attacks so severe that Naya had been hospitalized twice since the incident. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Barnes asked when they returned. The forewoman, a middle-aged African-American teacher from a neighboring district, stood with the verdict form in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of assault against a minor, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Patricia Langford, guilty." "On the charge of child endangerment, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of civil rights violations under color of authority, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Judge Barnes had to gavel for order repeatedly as spectators celebrated the verdict. Patricia sat frozen in her chair, finally confronting the reality that her actions had consequences. During the sentencing phase 2 weeks later, Judge Barnes was uncompromising in her remarks. "Ms. Langford, you held a position of trust and authority over children. You betrayed that trust in the most egregious way possible, using your power to inflict deliberate cruelty on a vulnerable child. Your actions were premeditated, racially motivated, and designed to cause maximum psychological harm." Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years of probation, during which she was prohibited from any employment involving children. She was also ordered to pay $50,000 in restitution for Nia's medical and therapeutic expenses. But the real victory was just beginning. The criminal conviction was just the first domino to fall. Within days of the verdict, the Ohio Department of Education announced a comprehensive investigation into Riverside Middle School and the entire Columbus City School District. What they found was a pattern of discrimination and abuse that had been systematically covered up for years. The investigation revealed that the Staff Protection Fund uncovered by journalist Derek Morrison was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past decade, the district had quietly settled 17 different cases involving allegations of racial discrimination, harassment of LGBTQ+ students, and abuse of children with disabilities. In every case, the accused staff members had been protected while the victims were silenced through non-disclosure agreements. Principal Pemberton, faced with criminal prosecution as a co-conspirator in the cover-up, negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for his cooperation with the broader investigation. His testimony revealed a culture of institutional racism that prioritized protecting adult employees over ensuring student safety. The state investigation led to the resignation of 6 district administrators, the termination of 12 teachers and staff members, and the implementation of sweeping reforms that would serve as a model for school districts across the country. But perhaps the most significant change came from an unexpected source: the United States Congress. Senator Maria Rodriguez of California, herself the mother of 2 school-aged children, had been following Nia's case closely. As the ranking member of the Senate Education Committee, she introduced federal legislation that would become known as the Nia Protection Act. The bill established mandatory reporting requirements for school-based discrimination, created federal oversight of educational civil rights violations, and provided funding for training programs to help educators recognize and address bias in their institutions. During the Senate hearing on the bill, Quincy was invited to testify about the failures that had led to her daughter's assault and the systematic changes needed to prevent similar incidents. "Senators," Quincy said as she sat at the witness table in her dress military uniform, "my daughter was failed by every adult who was supposed to protect her. Her teacher, her principal, her school district, and ultimately, a system that prioritizes institutional reputation over child safety." She paused, looking directly at the senators on the committee. "But this isn't just about one school or one district. It's about a culture that tolerates discrimination as long as it's quiet, that protects adults who abuse their power, and that silences children who dare to speak up about injustice." The committee room was silent as Quincy continued. "The Nia Protection Act won't prevent every act of cruelty or discrimination in our schools, but it will ensure that when these incidents occur, they are investigated thoroughly, prosecuted appropriately, and used as opportunities to create real, lasting change." The bill passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law 6 months later in a Rose Garden ceremony attended by Nia and her family. At the signing ceremony, President Jennifer Walsh addressed the crowd of civil rights advocates, educators, and student representatives. Today we take a crucial step toward ensuring that every child in America can attend school without fear of discrimination or abuse. Nia Blackwood's courage in speaking out against injustice has created a legacy that will protect countless children for generations to come. As the president signed the bill into law, Nia stood beside her parents, wearing a beautiful head wrap decorated with phoenixes rising from flames, a design she had created herself to symbolize her journey from victim to advocate. The ceremony concluded with Nia addressing the crowd, her voice clear and confident. "No child should ever have to go through what I experienced. But if my pain can prevent other kids from being hurt, then it was worth speaking up. Thank you for listening to my story and for helping to make sure it never happens again." From the White House came a call that would honor Nia's courage. 2 years after the assault that had shattered her world, Nia Blackwood stood before a packed auditorium at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The occasion was the opening of an exhibition called Voices of Resilience: Children Who Changed America, and Nia's story was featured prominently alongside those of Ruby Bridges, the Little Rock Nine, and other young people who had faced institutional discrimination with courage and dignity. The centerpiece of Nia's section was her original sketchbook, the one that had been in her hands when Patricia Langford first targeted her. The museum had opened it to a page where, in the days following her assault, she had written in careful letters, "You tried to erase me, but I redrew myself stronger." "When I was 12, Nia began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "a teacher used her power to try to break me. She thought that by taking away my hair, she could take away my dignity, my confidence, and my voice." The audience, a mixture of educators, civil rights advocates, parents, and students, listened in rapt attention as Nia continued. What she didn't understand is that true strength doesn't come from how you look on the outside. It comes from knowing who you are on the inside and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. At 14, Nia had grown into a confident young woman whose artwork had been exhibited in galleries across the country. Her paintings, which depicted themes of resilience, justice, and transformation, had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for educational reform initiatives and therapeutic programs for trauma survivors. "The woman who hurt me is in prison now," Nia said. "But this was never about revenge. It was about making sure that what happened to me never happens to another child. It was about proving that even the most powerful institutions can be changed when people refuse to stay silent about injustice." She gestured toward the exhibition behind her. Every child featured in this museum faced adults who tried to tell them they didn't belong, that they weren't good enough, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they were allowed to keep. But they all had one thing in common: they refused to believe those lies. In the audience, Quincy and Vincent watched their daughter with pride that bordered on awe. The quiet, artistic child who had been so brutally victimized had transformed into a powerful advocate whose voice was changing educational policy across the nation. The Blackwood Foundation, established with the settlement money from their lawsuit against the school district, had grown into a national organization providing legal support, therapeutic services, and advocacy training for families dealing with educational discrimination. They had successfully intervened in over 200 cases across 43 states, helping to secure justice for children who might otherwise have been silenced by institutional power. "Art saved me," Nia continued, her voice growing stronger. "When I couldn't find words to express my pain, I painted it. When I couldn't understand why someone would hurt me for no reason, I drew pictures of justice and healing. When I felt like I was disappearing, I created images of myself rising from the ashes." She paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience. "If you're a kid who feels different, who's been bullied, who's been told you don't belong, I want you to know that your difference is your strength. The thing that makes you feel vulnerable might be exactly what the world needs you to share." Nia smiled, touching the phoenix-decorated head wrap she wore. "I still have alopecia. My hair still falls out in patches. But now when I look in the mirror, I don't see something broken that needs to be hidden. I see a survivor who turned her pain into purpose." The applause was thunderous as Nia concluded her speech, but the most meaningful response came from a small group of children in the front row, students from Title I schools across the D.C. area who had been brought to the museum specifically to hear her story. Their faces reflected a mixture of understanding, hope, and determination that reminded everyone in the room why this fight had been necessary. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and viewed the exhibition, a young girl with cochlear implants approached Nia shyly. "Miss Nia," she said, "my teacher sometimes gets frustrated with me because I can't hear her when she's facing the board. She says I need to try harder to pay attention. What should I do?" Nia knelt down to the girl's level, her expression serious and caring. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Isabella, I'm 8. Isabella, first I want you to know that your teacher is wrong. You're not the problem. The system that doesn't accommodate your needs is the problem. Second, I want you to tell a trusted adult about what's happening. And third, I want you to remember that being different isn't something to fix or hide. It's something to celebrate." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small sketchbook. "I want you to have this. Whenever someone makes you feel bad about who you are, draw or write about it. Art helps us process pain and turn it into power." Isabella clutched the sketchbook to her chest, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Nia. I want to be brave like you." "You already are brave," Nia replied. "You just needed someone to remind you." As the day wound down and the museum began to empty, the Blackwood family stood together in front of Nia's exhibition, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret fighting back?" Vincent asked his daughter. "This could have been handled quietly, with less public attention and stress." Nia considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had just accepted their first settlement offer and moved on. My life would definitely have been easier." She paused, looking at the images of other young civil rights pioneers surrounding her display. "But then I think about Isabella and all the other kids who might have been hurt if Ms. Langford had been allowed to keep teaching. I think about the teachers who might have followed her example if there hadn't been real consequences. I think about the schools that changed their policies because of our case." Quincy put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. And I realize that easy isn't the same as right," Nia said firmly. "If my pain can prevent other children from experiencing what I went through, then every difficult day was worth it." The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of how one family's refusal to accept injustice had rippled outward to create change far beyond what they had ever imagined. Later that evening, back in their hotel room, Quincy received a call that brought their journey full circle. It was Dr. Jennifer Chen, the new superintendent of the Columbus City School District, the woman who had been brought in to implement the reforms mandated by the state investigation. "Colonel Blackwood," Dr. Chen began, "I wanted to give you an update on some developments you might find interesting. We just received notice that our district has been selected as a model site for the new federal anti-discrimination training program established under the NIA Protection Act." Quincy smiled. "That's wonderful news, Dr. Chen. How are the students responding to the changes?" "Remarkably well. Suspension rates are down 60%. Parent satisfaction scores have increased dramatically, and we've seen a significant improvement in academic performance across all demographic groups. It turns out that when children feel safe and valued, they learn better. Who would have thought?" The irony in her voice was unmistakable, and Quincy laughed. "Revolutionary concept." "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued. "The new art therapy program we implemented, inspired by Nia's advocacy work, has been so successful that 5 other districts are asking to replicate it. We're calling it the Voices program, and it's giving students a safe way to express their experiences and emotions through creative expression." "Nia will be thrilled to hear that," Quincy replied. "Art saved her life in many ways." After ending the call, Quincy joined her family on the hotel room balcony, where they were looking out over the lights of the nation's capital. The Washington Monument rose majestically in the distance, illuminated against the dark sky, a symbol of the principles they had fought to uphold. I got a call today too, Nia said quietly, from a girl in Portland whose teacher was making fun of her accent because her family immigrated from Somalia. She wanted to know if she should report it or just try to change the way she talks. What did you tell her? Vincent asked. I told her that her accent is beautiful because it's part of her story. I told her that teachers who mock students for their cultural background shouldn't be teaching anyone. And I told her that if she reports it and nothing changes, to call me and we'll make sure something does change. Quincy nodded approvingly. You're becoming quite the advocate, young lady. I learned from the best, Nia replied, leaning against her mother's shoulder. You taught me that some fights are worth having, even when they're hard, even when you're scared, even when everyone tells you to just let it go. As they prepared for bed that night, Nia pulled out her current sketchbook. She went through several each month now, filling them with ideas for paintings, notes about advocacy work, and letters from children who had heard her story. On the page she was working on, she had written, Justice isn't a destination. It's a journey we take together, one brave step at a time. Below that, she had begun sketching a new image, a diverse group of children standing together, each one unique but all connected by threads of light that formed a protective web around them. At the center of the image was a phoenix, its wings spread wide, carrying the children upward toward a bright, welcoming sky. 3 months later, at the annual National Education Conference in Chicago, Quincy was invited to deliver the keynote address to an audience of 10,000 educators, administrators, and policymakers. Her speech, titled, When Institutions Fail, Rebuilding Trust Through Accountability, became one of the most watched educational presentations in history. Ladies and gentlemen, Quincy began, standing at the podium in her civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of a military officer, I want to tell you about the day my daughter learned that the adults who were supposed to protect her could also be the ones who hurt her the most. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, weaving together Nia's story with broader themes about institutional responsibility, the courage required to challenge corrupt systems, and the transformative power of accountability. But the moment that resonated most with the audience came near the end of her speech. Some of you might be wondering why a military family chose to fight this battle so publicly, Quincy said. Why we didn't just transfer schools, accept a quiet settlement and move on with our lives. The answer is simple. Because justice that only serves one family isn't really justice at all. She paused, letting that statement sink in. Real justice requires us to ensure that what happened to our child never happens to anyone else's child. It requires us to transform broken systems rather than simply escape them. It requires us to fight not just for our own children, but for all children. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. In the aftermath of that conference, something unprecedented happened. Educators from around the globe began reaching out to share their own stories of confronting discrimination in their institutions, implementing bias training programs, and creating more inclusive learning environments. The movement that had begun with one family's refusal to accept injustice had grown into an international network of advocates, working to ensure that all children could attend school with dignity and safety. 5 years after the assault that had shattered her world, Nia Blackwood graduated as valedictorian from her high school class. Her graduation speech, delivered to a packed auditorium that included many of the people who had supported her family's fight for justice, was titled, The Armor of Self-Worth. When I was 12, she began, someone tried to strip away my armor. They took my hair, but they thought they were taking my dignity. They took my sense of safety, but they thought they were taking my voice. They took my trust in authority, but they thought they were taking my hope. She paused, looking out at the audience that included her parents, her legal team, supporters from across the country, and most importantly, dozens of young people whose lives had been changed by the reforms her case had inspired. What they didn't understand is that true armor isn't something you wear on the outside. It's something you build on the inside, piece by piece, through the love of people who see your worth, the support of communities that value justice, and the knowledge that your voice matters. Nia had been accepted to Harvard University with a full scholarship, where she planned to double major in art therapy and public policy. But her immediate plans included a gap year working with the Blackwood Foundation to expand their programs internationally. "I'm not the same girl who walked into that nurse's office 5 years ago," she concluded. "I'm stronger, braver, and more determined to fight for what's right. But most importantly, I know that I'm not alone. None of us are alone when we stand together for justice." The applause was thunderous, but the moment that would be remembered by everyone present came when Nia removed her graduation cap to reveal the beautiful natural hair that had finally begun growing back evenly. She had chosen to stop wearing protective wraps and wigs, deciding that her alopecia was simply another part of her story, rather than something to hide. "This is who I am," she said simply. "And I'm proud of every part of my journey, even the painful parts that taught me how to be strong." As the ceremony concluded, and families gathered for pictures and celebrations, a group of younger students approached Nia. They were participants in the Voices program at their middle school, the art therapy initiative inspired by her advocacy work. "Ms. Nia," one of them said, "we made something for you." They presented her with a collaborative painting they had created together, a phoenix rising from flames, surrounded by children of all different backgrounds and abilities, all reaching toward the sky. "It's beautiful," Nia said, genuinely moved by their gift. "What inspired you to create this?" "Your story," another student replied. "Our art teacher told us about how you used painting to heal from what happened to you. She said that sometimes when people hurt us, the best revenge is becoming even more ourselves than we were before." Nia smiled, recognizing the wisdom in those words. "Your teacher sounds very smart. And you're all very talented artists. Are you going to keep fighting for kids like us?" the first student asked. "Always," Nia replied without hesitation. "That's not just my job now. It's my calling. Every child deserves to feel safe, valued, and respected in school, and I'm going to spend my life making sure that happens." As the sun set over the graduation ceremony and families began to head home, the Blackwood family stood together one more time, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. "Any regrets?" Vincent asked his daughter, echoing the question he had posed years earlier at the museum. Nia considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I regret that it took something so painful to teach me how strong I could be. I regret that other children had to suffer because adults failed to do their jobs. I regret that change is often so slow and so hard." She paused, looking up at the evening sky where stars were beginning to appear. "But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret speaking up. I don't regret demanding that the system change rather than just moving on and hoping someone else would fix it." Quincy nodded, pride evident in her expression. "You've become exactly the kind of person I hoped you would be. Someone who makes the world better for everyone, not just herself." "I learned from the best," Nia replied, hugging both her parents. "So you taught me that love means protecting not just your own family, but all families. That justice means standing up for everyone who needs a voice, not just the people who look like you or share your experiences." As they walked to their car, Nia pulled out her ever-present sketchbook and wrote, "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to your purpose. Sometimes your greatest wound becomes your greatest strength. Sometimes the people who try to break you end up teaching you exactly how unbreakable you really are." 10 years later, Nia Blackwood would publish a groundbreaking research study on the long-term psychological effects of institutional discrimination on children. Her work would inform policy changes in schools across 6 countries and establish new standards for trauma-informed educational practices. 15 years later, she would be appointed as the youngest ever Director of Educational Civil Rights at the Department of Education, where she would oversee the implementation of comprehensive anti-discrimination policies in schools nationwide. 20 years later, she would establish the Blackwood Institute for Educational Justice, a research and advocacy center that would train thousands of educators, administrators, and policymakers in creating truly inclusive learning environments. But on this graduation night, she was simply a 17-year-old girl who had learned that even the darkest experiences could be transformed into light for others. She was a survivor who had become a warrior, a victim who had become an advocate, a child who had been broken and had chosen to heal not just herself, but an entire system. What started as one girl's trauma had become a movement that would protect countless children for generations to come. Sometimes justice doesn't come in one big strike. It grows from the courage of one small girl who refused to stay silent, spreads through the persistence of parents who would not be dismissed, strengthens through the conscience of witnesses who choose to stand up rather than stand by, and transforms through art that turns pain into power. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it changes the world. If you're facing your own battle against injustice, remember Nia's story. Remember that your voice matters, that your dignity is worth fighting for, and that you're never alone when you stand up for what's right. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's cruelty define your worth. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is to become even more yourself than you were before. Sometimes the greatest victory is not just surviving, but transforming your survival into strength that lifts others up. What would you have done if someone tried to strip away your child's dignity? Would you have fought the system as fiercely as Quincy, or looked for an easier path? Thank you to everyone who typed respect and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.